It's about time you showed up. You're almost as slow as Sleepy Joe. What kept you?
Yeah, sorry for that. I'll explain in a minute. Is Joe already here?
He's probably fallen back asleep by now, so we better go wake him up.
Acting like I can't hear your fat ass talking about me like that. Hey Barack, glad you could make it.
Good to see you again, Joe. How are you feeling after your dropout from the election?
Not gonna lie, man. It feels like a huge weight has been lifted off my back.
Yeah, well, don't get too comfortable yet, Joe. You've still got to run the country until the end of the year after all.
Does he? It's not like we've seen you in public since the announcement. Anyway, let's put politics to the side for now, since we all know I'm going to be back in office by the end of the election. How about you tell us why you were held up, Barack? We've been planning this catch-up for weeks after all.
I was basically just finishing up the showcase mode for WWE 2K24, and I honestly just forgot to check what time it was.
It's taken you this long to finish it? The game's been out for nearly 6 months.
Oh, come on, Donald, you know how tiring showcase mode can be. It's just the same thing every year. You go through a certain amount of moves that the game tells you to perform, watch some boring-ass cutscenes during the middle of the matches, and so on and so forth. I got up to the WrestleMania 25 match before I called it quits when I got the game a few days after its release. But I wanted to get my hands on the Fiend, so I made the decision to go back to the showcase mode and finish the rest of it.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, I do agree with showcase being boring to play. It honestly feels like a massive slog to go through. I ended up having multiple McDonald's breaks before I finally completed this year's version of it, for example.
Multiple? Donald, how long did it take you to play through the showcase?
I'd say a whole 12-hour sitting. I did end up stopping 5 times during the course of it for those previously mentioned McDonald's breaks.
Donald, that's disgusting to think about.
Okay, you know what? I have to say it. Showcase mode really isn't as bad as you guys are making out to be.
Do you ever get tired of being wrong, Joe? I guess not, considering all the bad decisions you've made during your presidency.
What the hell happened to putting politics to one side?
I agree. Please, Joe, continue.
Thank you, Barry. So yeah, I honestly don't think showcase mode is as bad of a mode as people say it is.
May I ask why?
Well, for starters, it's not like you're playing the mode for no reason. Not only do you get a great nostalgia feeling going back and playing these legendary matches, but the rewards you get can be great. An example being the Fiend, the character that made you go back to finish this year's showcase to begin with.
But on the flip side, Joe, it honestly felt like a huge nuisance having to go back to it just so I could get the Fiend in the first place. I mean, I lasted 6 months playing the game before I finally made the decision that I needed Bray Wyatt's alter ego on my playable roster.
And in regards to playing those legendary matches, if I wanted to do that, Joe, I'd just create that match on regular play mode, which basically makes the showcase mode null and void.
But what if you wanted to recreate The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels match from WrestleMania 25 on play mode, but the actual arena wasn't available unless you went through the showcase and unlocked it?
Then at that point, it just becomes an obligation to play the damn mode, and that should never be the case.
Okay, look, maybe that's the case for this year's version, but I'd argue that's not the case for the rest of the showcase modes that we've been given over the years.
I'll agree with that. At the very least, some of the older showcase-like modes had a good enough reason to be played. In fact, whilst we've been talking about this, I've actually found a tier list covering them all. How about we go over them and give our takes on them, and see if Joe's argument is indeed a solid one?
I guess it would be a good way to kick off our catch-up day. Fine then, let's do this. I'm instantly noticing, though, that we have the Attitude Era mode from WWE 13. Should we even be counting that? It's not even a 2K showcase.
It's on the list, so I'm considering it viable.
Just making sure. Go ahead and put that one into the goated tier then.
Nice to see we're on the same wavelength for once. It's not like that happens often.
I'm so glad you agree with me, Joe. The Attitude Era mode was an absolute banger. It was the first time the games were truly dedicating time to acknowledge the great days of old. Not as old as you, of course, Joe, but my point still stands.
That shot was more forced than Roman Reigns' 2015 push.
As good as this mode is, I feel like you guys are overhyping it a bit.
You've entered dangerous territory here, Barry. Explain yourself.
I understand the praise for it. Fully bringing the Attitude Era to light in the games for the first time, as well as bringing back multiple legendary stars from the previous era, but bringing more than just the likes of Stone Cold and The Rock back as legends had already been established with the previous game. WWE 12's Road to WrestleMania incorporated multiple legends that we hadn't seen in ages. The Road Warriors, Vader, and Arn Anderson. And I can't help but feel that should maybe detract points from the Attitude Era mode.
I consider that point to be null and void, to be honest, Barry. I'd argue that SmackDown vs. Raw 2011 was the first game to do this, as it brought back legendary wrestlers for you to face during The Undertaker's road to WrestleMania, like Jake the Snake Roberts and He Who Shall Not Be Named.
Joe, are you even talking about the right franchise?
Nah, he's surprisingly cooking there, Barry. Look, having the wrestlers is great and all, but it's not just about them. It's about bringing everything back. You had the Attitude Era arenas that you'd unlock as you play through the mode, not to mention special attires too. Old school championships that we hadn't seen in quite some time. You could even unlock bonus matches through completing all of the objectives the game gave you. And if all that's not enough, you mentioned the legends, right? How about the crazy ton of Attitude Era stars they brought to the game, too?
You don't need to educate me on this, guys. I know the deal with it. I just felt like my previous argument needed to be made for the sake of it. That's all.
Well, Barry, I'd argue that it shouldn't need to be made anyway because Road to WrestleMania and the showcase modes are two completely different things.
On the topic of Road to WrestleMania, we should definitely do a tier list for that mode, too.
But yeah, great points all around, gentlemen. This was the time where playing past matches didn't really feel like a massive burden, as this was the first game in the WWE series that truly gave you the chance to play and experience those matches in a showcase-like format to begin with. That, and the fact it basically gave us a whole nother game worth of content with everything from the Attitude Era, puts this as a goated entry, regardless of if it's a true showcase mode or not.
Excellent start, gentlemen. And speaking of excellent, is that 2K14 showcase I see there?
I'm not too sure if they were even calling these showcases until 2K15, but yes, you would be correct, Donald.
Another banger, correct?
Jesus, Joe, I owe you an apology. I wasn't familiar with your game.
It's all good, Trumpy. It's nice to be able to move on after going at each other's throats in the election scene for the past 4 years.
Very true. For clarity, though, I would have beaten you this year.
For the love of God, Donald. Anyway, I'd argue that this version of celebrating WrestleMania has actually been further cemented as a banger game mode after this year's showcase.
I agree. I know we'll get into why this year's version was incredibly mid-later, but the overall showcase this year was pretty much botched, even without the issues that we'll be going over. 40 years of WrestleMania only had 21 matches. Now, after playing it, I'm actually relieved about that fact, but in concept before 2K24's release. This felt like a major step down when you look at how much content the 30 years version in 2K14 had to offer.
How many matches did this game mode offer?
I'm over on Smack Talks now, and the list is as follows. You have the Hulkamania chapter for starters, 11 matches including his legendary clash with Andre the Giant.
Did you guys know me and Hogan are best friends?
Finding the strength to care about that is exhausting. You then have the New Generation chapter, which includes 7 matches. Then the Attitude Era chapter that includes 4.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. It makes sense, though, given how the last game was pretty much all about that era, as we just discussed a moment ago.
Then the Ruthless Aggression chapter. 12 matches, which included bangers like Batista versus Undertaker and John Cena versus Shawn Michaels.
Goldberg and Brock's first Mania match being a part of this is actually kind of hilarious, though.
And then finally, what is labeled as the Universe Era chapter, which had the most recent Mania bangers at the time.
Like Edge versus Del Rio and Cena versus Miz.
Damn it, Donald, you know what I mean.
I think you mean Edge versus He Who Shall Not Be Named.
Okay, I see what you're doing now, Joe. Anyway, that brings us to a total of 47 matches. 26 more than what we got in 2K24's showcase.
So basically half of the McDonald's breaks Donald took during his showcase playthrough.
I'll allow that, Joe, since I made another election jab at you a minute ago. But yeah, that's a lot of goddamn content.
But I think a question does need to be answered here. Is this a case of quality or quantity?
Definitely quality. And I have 2 reasons to back up my argument.
Go ahead and tell us them, Donald.
For starters, the gameplay style of 2K14 is much quicker and free. What I mean by free is that you're not limited by the mechanics that WWE games have these days. Back then, you could do anything. It was basically a massive sandbox where you could do whatever you wanted. And it added to the overall experience. As for my second reason, sure, there were objectives that you had to follow throughout the match you were playing, but they were nowhere as tedious as the ones you have to follow in the more recent showcases. The ones we have now just feel like an unnecessary way of panning out and extending the time you'd be playing the showcase for, which in turn makes them more of a burden to play through.
You know what? I think you've made your case perfectly there, Donald. I think we were all in agreement that 30 years of WrestleMania was going to go in the goated tier, but it was important that the quality and quantity question was answered. And the double count of matches in 2K14's showcase are definitely an example of quality, because of the reasons Donald just brought up.
Then I say we put it where it belongs and move on, gentlemen. Unfortunately, things begin to take a massive decline from here, and it never seems to recover after this.
Okay, hold on. Things may have gotten worse from here, but I'd argue the 2K15 showcase content wasn't the worst of it.
I agree, Joe, but potentially not for the same reasons. It goes without saying that 2K15 is one of the worst installments in the franchise. A terrible integration into the new generation that came with glitches, a lack of a roster, awful slow gameplay, and the removal of the unlimited sandbox style that 2K14 had. A terrible experience all around.
Very true. But what does that have to do with the showcase mode?
I had to set the scene, Barry, so I could then make the point on how 2K15 Showcase was a shining light in what was a huge downgrade of a game from its predecessors. It was because of 2K15's terrible quality that I feel the Showcase mode is able to be remembered more fondly because it's arguably the best part of the game.
That's a fair take. I mean, the whole Showcase idea was still new at the time, too. Not to mention the objectives didn't feel as panned out as the ones we get in this year's version.
And the storylines 2K picked in the first place, I'd say, were pretty good. Whilst it may seem a bit weird to people that most of the showcase options came from 2011, which was just a few years before this game's release. The Punk and Cena summer feud, as well as Orton and Christian's rivalry, were fun enough to go back to. Not to mention the Hall of Pain as well.
But you know, guys, there is a black sheep hidden here.
Are you referring to the Warrior Showcase?
Correct. It's been documented since his passing a decade ago that the man behind the mask really wasn't as great of a guy as we thought. So these days I think, why on earth would I want to go back and replay a career of someone like that?
I don't care enough to argue that fact. So let's just put the Warrior Showcase in a lower tier and stick the others in good. Like I said, they're basically the best parts of 2K15 and should have a ranking that shows that.
Very good. On that note, I think I'm going to make the same case for the Stone Cold Showcase from 2K16.
Can we use the same argument here, though? I mean, 2K16 was a better game overall than 2K15.
Yeah, but these days I'd argue that it's only marginally better. Hell, the only 2K wrestling game from the previous decade I'd say is worthy enough to go back to is 2K19.
I'd argue 2K18 as well because the vibes with that game are on point.
Sure, the music and overall setting is pretty good, but the gameplay is just as slow as 2K16 and 17. Anyway, we're digressing. The point is that much like the showcase mode being the highlight of the previous game, I'd say that's also the case for 2K16 too. I know it's mainly because we're talking about playing Stone Cold Steve Austin's career, which basically makes the whole thing pretty epic anyway. But when literally everything else in the game is mid at best, it raises the stock levels of the showcase mode quite high because of the mediocrity of everything else.
What are you cooking, Donald? Because it smells delicious.
It's probably just the food for his next McDonald's break that we can smell.
Screw off Obama.
But yeah, I think enough has been said. Let's just stick this showcase into the good tier as well. Moving on though, we have the 2K16 and 17 Hall of Fame showcases next.
I actually don't remember a damn thing about these two, which is bad considering I'm the one defending the showcase mode in the first place.
It could be your dementia acting up, Joe.
Shut up, Donald. I know for a fact that you've forgotten about these two as well.
You would have laughed at that a decade ago, Barry. We live in such a snowflake era nowadays. But yeah, you're right. I've forgotten everything about these two. Barack, get your ass back on Smack Talks and give us some context.
I actually had to go to WWE.com itself to get some proper info. But basically, both showcases were made to celebrate the Hall of Fame classes of those respective years. So for example, with 2K17's version, you'd be able to get your hands on legends like Diamond Dallas Page, and it also came with some old school matches for you to play through as well.
As interesting as it sounds, it also sounds quite bare-boned as well.
Yeah, I think the only reason why I find this to be interesting information is because I honestly never bought either of these showcases, so I don't really know anything about them.
I think it's understandable why both of these are pretty forgettable. They were released during the second half of both the game's lifespans, and at that point it's pretty well known that the interest for that year's wrestling game would have mostly died down at that point. People perhaps looked at these DLCs and thought that they wouldn't really add too much to the game, instead thinking it could be a potential waste of money. And I can honestly understand that argument. They just both sound pretty mid to me. Kind of fitting we have a tier named that actually. Does anyone have an issue with me putting them there?
Nope, go right ahead.
Perhaps someone in the comments could educate us if it turns out these showcases are actually better than what we're saying.
Moving on to better pastures now, we have the Daniel Bryan Showcase from 2K19.
I had a good time with this one, I won't lie. I think it's a blend of the showcase not being too long, combined with a much more fluid gameplay of 2K19.
And all the matches I'd say were relevant enough to be included in the mode. I really like how the showcase starts too. You get to play as Bryan Danielson in a match with John Cena on a random Velocity episode. It adds some much appreciated history from Bryan's career, instead of ignoring it like Vince would do whenever he was able to grab a popular indie star back in the day.
And then bury them after a few weeks. EC3 says hi.
As do many, many others.
Yeah, I think that's all that needs to be said. It's definitely one of the more simple showcases 2K have made, but that's why I like it. The objectives still weren't at a point where I feel like they were just padding out time. And as you said, Donald, the fluid 2K19 gameplay makes it even better. It helps seal this as a classic showcase in my eyes.
I wouldn't go that far, Joe. It's a good showcase to play if you have nothing better to do, but I definitely wouldn't call it goated or anything like that.
Fine, whatever. Stick it in the good tier then.
Good tier it is. Now as for the next showcase, boys, I'm making the executive decision to put this into the bad tier and move on.
Anything regarding 2K20 can get put in the damn trash along with Kamala Harris.
Quit going after my VP like that.
She's literally my opponent in the election, Joe.
Joe, do you agree with my executive decision?
Oh yes, sorry Barry. As President of the United States, I order you to carry that motion, whilst also making the point that it's not the showcase itself that's at fault for this, but rather because of the fact that 2K20 is literally unplayable.
Whilst we're talking about that abysmal game though, I'm quite surprised that the 2K Originals isn't on here.
That whole thing was more of a tower mode rather than a full-on showcase. Besides, even if it was on here, I'd refuse to talk about it anyway. We only played that mode to unlock the Fiend as a playable character, and that's it.
Wait a minute, that whole 2K Originals mode is real? I thought that was just some weird dream I had.
I'm not even going to make a dementia joke here because I wish I could forget about that whole damn waste of a mode too.
Let's return to greener pastures then with 2K22. The showcase mode would return. This time we would get one centered around the legendary career of Rey Mysterio.
Now this is when the objectives became a way to waste time rather than to progress the matches, which in turn ruined the overall experience for me. I won't lie, boys, because of that alone. I'd honestly just say to stick all the remaining showcases into the mid-tier and end this list.
Oh, come on, Donald.
See, I expected that response. Listen, that's just my opinion, but this is a group decision. So both of you give your points already, but just know I don't have much to add from this point on.
Let's get through these last few showcases quickly then. Whilst Donald is correct on the objective argument, I still had a good time playing through this showcase. A big part of it was probably due to the fact that we were playing as one of the most fun and exciting wrestlers to ever walk the earth. Rey's incredibly awesome moveset helped elevate the enjoyment levels here.
I really liked how completing the bonus match at the end of the showcase unlocked Dominic for your playable roster. Not to mention the alternate characters you can unlock here too, like Messiah Rollins and the unmasked Kane from 2008. This is how these kind of characters should always be unlocked, rather than locking them behind a paywall of a game mode that none of us are going to play.
The business side of me praises 2K for the scummy creation of my faction. The gamer side of me, however, wants to throw whoever came up with the concept of the mode straight into jail with no bail.
Speaking of unlockables, Joe, how about the alternate Rey attires?
Oh, 2K smashed those out of the park like it's a game of Wii baseball. As for the matches themselves, I thought they did a very good job with the selection. I found myself enjoying all the matches we were given. The showcase does enough in my eyes to give it a good tier at the very least.
I'm all right with that, Joe. How about the Cena showcase from 2K23?
Now, I will say the concept of this showcase was very well executed. Instead of playing through Cena's greatest hits, you get to play through all of his biggest misses, the biggest losses the man ever took in his career. Flipping the showcase concept on its head like that I thought was great. But that's all I've got to say. My earlier points still stand. It's mid to me.
Trump is right regarding the showcase concept point. It was a welcome change of pace for me. Not to mention most of the matches here are quite legendary. From his debut against Kurt Angle to his once-in-a-lifetime showdown with The Rock. And the absolute battering he took from Brock Lesnar at SummerSlam.
Points once again go to the bonus match content from me. Getting to pick who you thought was Cena's greatest opponent in a final match was great. And then after that, you have to go up against the only character in existence that Goku himself would be fearful of.
Oh yeah, I got a laugh out of the Super Cena finale match. The showcase also had an incredible Easter egg. Joe, do you know about the alternate ECW One Night Stand ending?
Oh hell yes, Barry. As soon as I heard about that, I went back to the match with Rob Van Dam just to see it for myself. It was a great attention to detail.
I disagree. Where the hell was the riot scene from the angry ECW fans?
There is certainly a lot of character and effort in this showcase, and I personally think it overshadows the negatives that Donald brought up. So let's go ahead and stick this into the top of good tier.
That's perfect. Looks like we've reached the end game, boys.
40 years of mid.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but 2K24's showcase missed the mark for me. Compared to the 30 years version a decade prior. It's definitely lacking content. 21 matches is a lot, but that's only half the effort the 2K14 showcase gave us.
Don't be ignoring the variables, guys. A lot more time and effort has to go into perfecting games these days. So I can understand why there was only time to include half the amount 2K14 did. And I imagine 2K didn't want to tread on old ground too much and pick a bunch of matches already shown in the older showcase, as it may ruin returning playthroughs of it for some players.
Joe, don't be pretending that 2K gives a damn about players returning to a game that's 10 years old, considering how they're too busy shutting down the online services of literally the previous installment just over a year after its damn release. And let me just point this out, as Barack said, 21 matches is an amazing amount of content, but when you pad those matches out with completely unnecessary objectives, which forces me to play a match for 10 minutes longer than I should have, then that's when I draw the line and throw this hot garbage into the mid-tier.
If 2K are adamant on continuing the showcase mode after this, then they seriously need to reconsider the thinking of how they make the objectives, because with the way things are now, showcase is one of the worst things about the games these days, a burden that you only play just to get some cool unlockables. I really do hope that they change things up in that regard, but as for 2K24's showcase, it's a mid for me too. The negatives this time outweigh the positives.
As Donald said, this is a group decision, and the majority has voted on mid. So I won't argue with this.
Thank you, Joe. Well, that was a lot of fun. I think this calls for my long-awaited McDonald's break. Anyone else in?
McDonald's jokes at your expense aside. Yeah, I'm pretty famished. It's close to lunchtime anyways.
We could maybe brainstorm some other things that we could do later on.
Sounds good. I might have some ideas cooking.